Are you tired of feeling tired because of your drinking habits? I am James Swanwick. Welcome to the show. Today we're talking to Don Drury, a 67-year-old man based outside of Boston who is 15 months alcohol free as we are recording this. Wow, 15 months alcohol free. And Don is about to share his story about drinking wine, taking bottles of wine to parties, and being foggy, low energy, not having focus, and being 20 pounds heavier, to how he is today, 15 months later, 20 pounds lighter with energy, clarity, focus, what it's meant for his marriage, what it's meant for his business life, and what does he do when he goes to a party now? And he's the only alcohol-free person. What do his friends say? Have they accepted it or do they reject it? We're going to find out. Don Drury, welcome to the show. Congratulations on 15 months alcohol-free, sir.
Yeah, thank you, James. And thank you for having me here today.
Thank thank you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live, what you do, what life is like at the moment.
Yeah, well, I'll say, first of all, life is good. The alcohol-free life is wonderful. And I live outside of Boston in north central Massachusetts. It's a beautiful area, fruit country. For anybody that's from up in this part of the world, may know this area. I grew up in this part of the world outside of Boston and have been married for 44 years and settled in the area. Have two daughters, one of whom still lives in the area. She's a writer and a head librarian at a local high school. And the other one lives with our grandson in Michigan, in southern Michigan, with her husband, chiropractors and artists in their own right. So,
Well, you're looking pretty good, Don, I have to say. You feeling pretty good?
yeah, I feel great. I mentioned, James, that, just having the energy that I think that was the number one biggest change for me, that not realizing or probably realizing, but each day waking up kind of in that little cloud, that fog that so many of us experience. And I was a daily drinker and a fairly heavy drinker before I came into the program. And I finally, after many attempts at thinking, oh, I can cut back or I can do this. I mean, I was a heavy whiskey, scotch drinker. And my idea of cutting back was I'll just have beer or wine today, or I'll take a day off. And after a day off, I felt great, having a day of being a little bit more clear. So the next day I'd be right back at it. So, that difference alone of just not having that feeling and starting each day with a lot more energy and focus has been great.
Yeah, incredible. Let's go back to when you were a regular drinker. How many years do you think you drank alcohol for if you look back on your life?
Well, for a long time. So as you mentioned, I'm 67. I started, just out of high school into first year of college. So 18 years old probably. And, at first it was relatively moderate. I'd drink at parties and I'd do things like that. And I grew up my dad was an aerospace engineer in the early days, and he worked on the optics that were in the early space flight programs for the US and in the U-2 spy plane. And it was almost like those movies that we've all seen, like Mad Men or, The Right Stuff, where the businessmen would get together and have their cocktails and highballs. So I grew up, in kind of a culture accepting of that. So at first it was, have a beer on a cold day, have a drink at the end of a day. But over the years, it got to be heavier, and I got into a work environment where I was traveling quite a bit. There'd always be evening dinners, and there'd be wine with dinner. There might be drinks before, go back to the hotel and have drinks afterwards. And just over the years, I felt it gradually built up to a point where I finally realized this was way more than I should be doing.
Do you look back now and realize the cultural conditioning that was going on in terms
Oh,
of the
absolutely.
drinking?
Yeah, I loved, one of the things you point out in the program and the P90 program was, attractively packaged poison. And absolutely that resonated. And even some of the examples and some of the recordings and the videos we watched in the program of, how people talk, wine aficionados talk about the seductive qualities of wine, or how it's built into the culture of being part of the inner circle and going out and, we'll sit around and we'll have that drink together and solve the problems of the world. And it's definitely ingrained from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah. If you're a first time listener to the show, you might hear Don referencing the program. What he's referencing is our 90-day stop drinking program, which is called Project 90. If you'd like to learn about that stop drinking program, you can click the link in the show notes. You can also go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/project 90. Even going back further, how was your drinking habit mirrored, or rather, let me rephrase that. Growing up, before you even started consuming alcohol, who did you see drinking alcohol that may have, in hindsight, led you down a path of just normalizing drinking attractively packaged poison?
Yeah, I would. Well, definitely my parents. I mean, my father, as I said, he was in that industry, so he would come home at the end of the day, and the natural thing was to say, let's have a drink before dinner, put out a little snack, maybe have wine with dinner, or on weekends he was always working on different projects and carpentry things and projects around the house, and he'd have a cold beer when he was doing that. So there was definitely that, and my uncles and people like that were in the family working with him or in that immediate circle. My parents' friends who they would have over to the house, that was part of the socializing. And those days, people smoked pretty regularly. My dad actually passed from emphysema in 1989, but he was a heavy smoker when I was young. So, sitting around with an ashtray full of cigarette butts and drinks in hand. Um,
And so seeing that growing up was just the norm, and you then mirrored that behavior as you got into your teens, did you?
Well, not yeah. I was through high school. I wasn't, I didn't get into like a wild drinking thing in high school. But when I left home and went to college, definitely that first year being in the dorm, I was away from home. It was a common thing, in the school I was in. So I just fell right in with that crowd. And alcohol was part of it. It was the 1970s, so other things were part of that as well. But it was a very easy transition from, it didn't feel like something that was negative or frowned upon or anything like that from the
Mm.
culture that I grew up in.
So you're in your late 60s now. So what was it like in your, say, late 30s, 40s, and 50s in terms of your drinking habits? And what was your environment telling you about drinking and during those decades?
Well, I think, in retrospect, I see things a little different. But at the time, it felt like, it was part of the work culture that I was engaged in. So when I was, I traveled quite a bit. I worked for international companies. Wherever we were, there was always a group that would have dinner together. We would always have wine and drinks with dinner. And quite often, there'd be a group that would go back to the hotel and sit around and have a nightcap, quote unquote. Right. So that part of socializing and of feeling, and eventually in my career, I was in leadership roles, but it was a way that I felt like I was somewhat relatable to the team that worked for me. We weren't only boss and employee, but we were people that could sit and have a beer together or drink together and relate to each other. So it was definitely ingrained that way. In retrospect, I look at certain situations where when I think about how I showed up, whether it had been heavily drinking the night before and kind of not focused the next day or things like that, not that I wish I could take those years back, but I definitely would behave differently with the perspective I have now. So
When it was going on, though, you didn't perceive it to be a big deal. It was, even though you were
no,
foggy, distracted, and maybe not operating at your best, if I'm hearing you correctly, it wasn't a big deal because others were doing it and it was just part of doing business. It was just part of life. Was that your perspective at the time?
it was, and it was like, we all had a rule, never miss the call the next morning. So, we'd roll out of bed, bright tailed and bushy eyed, as we would say. And, but we would be there for the event or we would be there for a customer meeting, physically at least. And, we had results, we were successful. So I didn't look at it as something that was inhibiting or, preventing success or anything like that. So, yeah, it was just kind of a natural part of functioning. And there were periods over those decades that you talked about where I would, I'd have been traveling and I'd have been drinking heavily or whatever. And I'd say, whoa, I need a break. And I might take a week or 10 days and just really take it easy and recover. And it was physical exhaustion as much as anything. But then as soon as, I was feeling good again, I would just slip right back into the same mode. So.
You were raising two daughters at that time. Your daughters are now in their 30s and 40s, as I understand it, and you have a grandchild. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
yeah, now looking back again on those decades, say 30s, 40s, 50s, did that compromise, or did your drinking habits compromise your ability to parent, or did it compromise your marriage at any stage? And were you even aware that it was compromising those things in family life at the time?
Yeah, I don't think that it really, affected the girls that much. I mean, they both grew up, in a household where they saw me having drinks at night with dinner and things like that, and both of them do like to have a glass of wine or a beer or a drink occasionally, but neither of them seems to do it to any kind of excess, and they're both very aware of that. So I didn't feel like I passed on some kind of a legacy or anything like that. And with all the travel and the things that I did, I felt like I was always able to be present for them and for the various events. But there are stories we tell. One of which is, always gets a chuckle. And I came home from a long trip at one point in time, and my daughter was, probably 5, 6 years old, my younger daughter. And I came through, and she said, "Dad, you look like you could use a scotch." I said, "Whoa, well, what's that? Do you know what a scotch is?" She said, "Yeah, that's what men's drink after a hard day at work."
Wow.
So, and she was right. So I went in the kitchen and I got a glass of whiskey and I got her a rocks glass with apple juice. And we sat on the couch and my wife came in and saw the two of us and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm having a drink with my daughter." And, so that was how deeply ingrained some of that was. But
Yeah.
we have great relationships now. In terms of the marriage, my wife was always a person who was teaching fitness classes, very aware of her diet and keeping me getting into the gym and focused on things. And she would point out if I was getting heavy, on the heavier end of the scale, she'd say, "You really can't do this forever." And of course, the older I got and the more impact, the years, it's not as easy to recover when you hit 50 or 60 as it was when you were 30 or 40. So, and she was right. And I finally had the sense to pay attention and admit that.
So when you had the sense to pay attention, I guess it sounds like you had the sense to pay attention to healthy eating habits and doing some exercise, but it didn't mean stopping drinking alcohol, because as you went into your, let's say, 50s and early 60s, which would have been, you hit 60 7 or 8 years ago, but let's just say mid to late 50s, early 60s, you were somewhat healthy, or at least practicing healthy habits while simultaneously drinking what we refer to as attractively packaged poison. So I guess now in hindsight, did it feel like you were running a race with a ball and chain around the ankle? Like you were doing
Oh,
pretty
yeah.
well, but not doing well enough?
Absolutely. You look at it and that's a great analogy. And the other thing was that, I had regular annual physicals. My numbers, from a medical standpoint were always okay. My cholesterol wasn't that high. My sugar level wasn't that bad. It was a little high, but, and all of the normal things that the docs want to measure and check you on they were all within normal ranges. So I thought, well, great. I've got a good tolerance. I can enjoy this lifestyle. And, I'm taking enough care of myself to offset. That's what I was telling myself, to offset the things that I was doing. But then you look back and you say, wow, to go to the gym in the morning and not be, have had 3 or 4 drinks the night before feels much, much different. And it is like
Mm,
getting rid of that ball and chain. Never mind 20 less pounds to carry around when you're doing it, right? So.
mm. So you must have joined our Project 90 Stop Drinking programming community when you were 65 or 66.
Yeah, it was
So,
May of last year. So yeah.
so May of 2023, you joined. Uh, Not so much the days or the weeks before you made the choice to come and get some professional support stopping drinking, but in the years in your 60s, from like 60 until that time, were you pondering stopping drinking? Were you pondering cutting back? Were you cognizant that drinking was holding you back, but you were like, I'm not going to stop. There's no way. This is just what I do. Like, what was your viewpoint in your 60s leading up to that choice to get support?
Yeah, I would say in my early 60s, I was definitely aware and was thinking about cutting back, right? And I would try various strategies, that I would see various onlines, different blog posts and programs and ideas. So I would try, alternating days or saying 2 days in a row alcohol free as a minimum, and different little strategies, or limiting the number of drinks, so have a drink before dinner and a glass of wine with dinner and be done, which wasn't my norm at all. So I would try those things, and they would sometimes last for a few weeks, but I would usually, for whatever reasons, get triggered or slip back into my old patterns. So I felt like I was in this loop, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, are you tired of being tired? I got to that point where I was sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? And trying the same things. And during that time, I had started my own business 6 years ago, as you mentioned. And 2018, we launched where I was doing pretty well. And in the early part of 2020, January, I made a comment to my wife, Michelle, and said, well, barring a meteor strike or a global pandemic, we're doing pretty well. And March 2020 came, and along with it came the pandemic. So that shifted, I was not traveling at all. I was at home. There was a lot going on in the world that was just, spiraling. And in many ways, I just found myself at home and drinking more heavily and thinking about it, but also just letting it be the habit. And that's when I finally, right before the program, I said, you know what, I've just got to do something to break out of this, because all my strategies weren't working.
So all your business strategies weren't working, or all your health strategies weren't working, or all your mindset strategies weren't working.
The business strategies were working okay. I came through the pandemic year, the first year, took a little bit of a hit, but then things recovered. I actually helped people learn how to do online meetings and remote selling and things like that in my customer base. So, I managed to stay the course business wise, but I think it was mindset. And we invested some things in a home gym. We have a house with large enough space to do that, and I was fairly consistent, but again, I was doing that still with the alcohol in my system. So it was never the same as totally cleaning yourself up and getting
Mm.
back to it.
So the strategies that in hindsight were ineffective for you, either reducing or stopping, were what?
Well, like a couple of things I mentioned, like trying to take, set some sort of a pattern in a week, So we talk about time blocking our calendars. I would try to say, oh, well, I'm going to have a minimum of 3 days alcohol free in a week, or 4 days. But then I would get the day back on, and it would be like a celebration of, oh, well, you had a day off, and maybe we'll take tomorrow off. But then tomorrow would come, well, maybe we'll just have a drink today. And, then it would be 3 or 4 days, and I'd look at the calendar and say, well, I did 2 days this week. Okay, I'll do better next week. But I just never established that discipline to break that pattern. Or it would be, as I mentioned, I was a whiskey drinker, a heavy whiskey drinker. So my idea, and sometimes of cutting back, would be, well, I'll just have a glass of wine today. But that bottle of wine would be open. Well, let's have a second glass. Oh, well, somebody else had a glass. There's just a little left. Let's finish the bottle, right? So it was never very successful at saying there are ways of moderating or reducing. And part of what I learned in the program was just the science of addiction, and how our bodies get to a level of tolerance and, needing more and more to have that same feeling. And in retrospect, that's probably what part of my challenge was. Those things just weren't hitting the right button. So.
Did your wife, Michelle, say anything to you about your drinking habits at any point?
She would, but she was, she was sort of quietly prodding me, I guess. Yeah, just saying, "Look, you've got to stop this." Or if I would, I would make a comment, or if I'd fall asleep in a chair watching TV at night, she'd say, you got to do something. You got to make a change. And I probably for a while, for a period there, was kind of, hearing it but not hearing it. Like, oh yeah, don't worry, I'm okay. The numbers are still okay when I go to the doctor. I'll work out tomorrow. Everything's good. Um, but subconsciously, I'm sure I knew, that she was right.
Was she drinking simultaneously, or was she not drinking?
No, she was pretty much not drinking. She is a person who will, occasionally, and by that I mean once every month or two, have a glass of wine with dinner. But she never had the same
Got it.
habit.
Got it. So you were representing both of you in the couples drinking championships, Don.
Yeah, I had to do my best to keep the distilleries in business. So.
Yeah. So what was the point where you decided that your strategies had been ineffective and now you are willing to actually invest time and money in professional services to actually help you? And was your intention to just stop for a little while and then go back to moderation? Was your intention to just quit entirely? Like what was the moment or the moments that kind of got you to the point where it's like, okay, I got to get some support with this?
Yeah, well, I think it was in the weeks leading up to when I connected with your program. There was actually a colleague of mine on LinkedIn who had been through the program. I think it was your 30-day program, and he had actually posted after he was, I think, a year alcohol free. And I reached out to him and I just said, "Hey, this is fantastic. I realize I need to do something." And he said, "Oh, well, go check out alcohol free lifestyle. It's really good. Do the work, and make the commitment for the program." Which at the time I was looking at the 90-day program. And I said, "Okay." So I did. I reached out and followed up, and then as soon as I started getting into the calls, my intent, to answer your question, was, let me get this break. Let me break the pattern and see if we can break the habit in 90 days. I have read the books like Atomic Habits and some of those things out there about takes at least 30 days, if not 60 to 90 days, to really break and start to reprogram yourself and recondition those paradigms in the way we think. So I thought that'll be good. I'll go through, I'll get that, then I can step back. And going in, I thought, then maybe I can moderate. Maybe I can have a glass of wine with dinner, or I can have a cold beer on a hot summer day, or whatever it might be. But somewhere about halfway through, about 45 days in the program, I was, I think, with Coach Victoria on one of the calls, and I just said, you know what? It isn't. We were talking about what happens on day 91. What are you going to do? And some people were just finishing up the program. I said, there is no day 90. This is the rest of my life. I'm done. And I just made that mindset shift. And I've never looked back. There's never been a question since then for me. There
Mm.
have been moments, of course, and triggers, but
So the mindset shift, the drop the mic moment, was about 45 days into the 90-day stop drinking program. And that was as a result of what, do you think? Like in hindsight, your mindset shifted and you went, okay, this is no longer something that I'm entertaining for just a 90-day block. This is something that I might actually commit to long term as a lifestyle, being completely 100% alcohol free. What was the piece of information that you got, or what was the thing that someone said, or what was the insight that led to that moment?
it's hard for me to pinpoint that one thing. But I think part of it was, as we go through the program, some of us would start at a period in time, and there'd be people on our calls and in the group that were at various points in their journey. And there were some people who had gone through and been alcohol free for 6 months or 9 months and then had a relapse and rejoined, or somebody that made it to 50 or 60 days and then, it was 4th of July weekend, or it was some family event, and they just thought, oh, I could have a drink, and then they slipped considerably. And hearing them share their stories about, I thought I could control things, but I was wrong. And I just recognized, I said, that's not a pattern I want to go to. I committed to this program, committed to myself. I need to make sure this is a lasting change. And somewhere in that process, I just came to the conclusion, and it wasn't like I might do this for the rest of the life. It was just like, okay, I'm done. It's not P90. It's at first my birthday's in September, so I had joined in May, so my 90 days would have been around now in August. And I said, well, I'm going to make it to my birthday. At one point, I said, I'll get it to my birthday and see how I've done then. And then I said, well, I'll make it to the end of 2023. But then, like I said, after the 6 weeks or so in the program, I said, no, those are false deadlines. I'm done. So,
Yeah. And while you had that, let's call it a drop the mic moment on day 45, there are other members, certainly I can share anecdotally, that get that on day 80 or day 7 or day 75, or they feel like maybe they haven't got it on day 90, but then they just go another month or two, day 120, month 5, and suddenly they get it. I mean, everyone's different, and I often get
mhm.
asked how long will it take before my mindset switches. Everyone is different. Um, in fact, if you're listening to the show here, I might invite you to scroll back through some of the episodes to an episode we did with a former client called Steve Wilt. And he won't mind me mentioning his name because he's been interviewed on the podcast several times. And he actually went through a different organization's stop drinking program and stopped, but then returned to drinking, then did a stop drinking program with another organization, stopped, and then returned to drinking again. And then he joined ours. And I think it was, if I remember correctly, I think it was on about day 60, in the day 60s of going through this, his third attempt really of getting coached around this, where suddenly he was on a call, and I think it was with Coach Victoria English as well, who's one of our top coaches here at Alcohol Free Lifestyle, where he said, Coach Victoria said something about the science of addiction and about alcohol, and all of a sudden he became angry, not at Coach Victoria, but he became angry at the way that his father had drunk in front of him, which kind of then led him to normalize that behavior. He was angry at the way that society has glorified alcohol. He was angry at celebrities who have liquor brands like Ryan Reynolds and The Rock and Beyonce and all these kind of Hollywood celebs who have. And he
Mhm.
was angry, and that anger in that moment was enough for him for the switch to go off. And he is now, I think he's coming up at least 2 years alcohol free, and he swears he'll never drink again. And that for him was the light bulb moment. He actually came and spoke at our annual alcohol free lifestyle retreat in January of 2024. We held it in Sedona, Arizona. So yeah, if you're listening to the show and you want to listen to Steve Wilt's moment, just scroll back, look for Steve Wilt. There's a 3-part series there, if I recall correctly. If you just look for Steve Wilt, part 1, part 2, part 3, I just invite you to listen to that. And, he shares a similar kind of drop the mic moment. But Don, you would have seen other people, I would imagine, not having that moment until later on in the program, or maybe some earlier.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, some later. I'm not sure about some earlier in the group that I was with. I think there were a bunch of us sort of coming to it together at various points. And then there were people who I started out, it's almost like we're in these little, you know, groups that start within a week or two of each other. And we kind of, through the communications, we would text with each other or be in touch with each other, send each other private messages and those kind of things. And a couple of those folks, did have episodes where they fell off and came back in. And I thought it's kind of like when you go to college and they say, look to your left and look to your right, because one of you may not be here in 4 years to graduate. There was definitely that feeling. And that also helped me see the risk of, no, don't think you can just, you know, go out and have that one little drink and be okay. You're committed for the 90
Yeah.
days. But yeah, it
Yeah.
is very individual. I get that.
Yeah. As a business owner and a coach here, I feel I've let down our clients if they have what we call a reset, which is they go through the 90 days and they drink during the 90 days when they're not supposed to. Thankfully, it happens rarely.
Hmm.
Uh, and also, thankfully, as much as I'm disappointed that that happens, and I always try to figure out ways to increase the likelihood that it won't happen, when people do share that it's happened, that they've had a reset, it's amazing how many clients then say, wow, that was inspiration for me to stay the course. So even though that, no one's obviously criticizing those who are resetting, but it does serve as a welcome warning sign, I guess. Like, wow, this is what could happen if you do go back and drink.
Well, and also I think for the people that I saw, and it was only a couple, you're right, it wasn't a common thing, but the couple that I saw, their recommitment when they came back was 10 times stronger. They
Yes.
recognized in themselves that, wow, I can't be lax about this. I have to show up. I have to do the work, pay attention to the videos, attend the weekly meetings, things like that that the program has, which I think are so valuable. So.
Yes. One of those gentlemen, and I'm sure he won't mind me referencing his name as well, because he also has been on the podcast and shared it, is a gentleman by the name of Ronnie, who's outside of Boston area as
Yeah,
well.
Ronnie was one of my good buds in the program. So great
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. So he's admitted later on that the first time he went through the program, he had lots of resistance. He was somewhat combative, I guess, energy to it, and ultimately had a reset, I think on day 60 or so. And he just wasn't showing up to calls, he says, and he wasn't engaged with the community. And there was still this kind of like separation between him and really leaning into the support. And then he said that he had a tough conversation with Coach Victoria English, who's our head coach at Alcohol Free Lifestyle. And then he recommitted, and then he went back and he started. And now he is absolutely flying. I mean, the changes in
Oh,
him
he
has
is.
been
He's
profound.
amazing.
Yeah. Same thing to the listener. I'd invite you just scroll back a few episodes and look for the episode with Ronnie, and you can hear his story. And he actually just came to Denver, Colorado in mid-August. We have a program called Boardroom, which is those folks who are at least a year alcohol free with us. They get to go into what's called Boardroom, and we have these mid-year annual meetups. We just had our first one actually in Denver, Colorado, and Ronnie was there looking as fit as a fiddle, so clear-minded, healthy. I think he said that he'd worked out almost every day for the past 3 or 4 months. He's happy. He's connected with his grandchildren and his children, and he just seems like he's flying in life. But that's an example of someone who expressed his resistance to change, I think, in the first 60 or so days, and then I guess in his own drop the mic moment, he was like, okay, I'm going to go back to day one and recommit to this. And now that has really steeled his resolve, I guess, and he's absolutely flying in life. And alcohol isn't a big deal for him at all now.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about actually while I was in the program, and I think on many of the coaching calls, was many of us in the program have this attitude of "Don't tell me what to do." We have to come to that mindset ourselves. So to be vulnerable enough to admit, yeah, I did fall off, and yeah, I do have to recommit, and all of those things, and watching, ourselves and others go through that was just incredibly powerful because it is, it's difficult, and I won't say it's only a male thing because I saw a lot of strong women in the program who went through similar things, but there was definitely a male ego aspect for some of us that, we even talked about it after the program. Well, don't tell me I can't moderate. And it's like, well, no, we can't tell you. You have to tell yourself. And that to me is part of the mindset click that it's like, no, nobody else you don't have to do this for somebody else. You're doing this for yourself. So.
Yeah, we have a lot of entrepreneurs and executive clients in our program, and very strong-willed, and like what makes them successful in business, which is getting things done, makes them challenging to coach in a way
Yeah.
through the 90 days to stop drinking, because now they have to kind of surrender power somewhat to a coach, and now the coach is telling them what to do, or the
And
community's
challenge
telling.
everything they hear, right?
Yeah, they're not used to that. Yeah, but those who are open to that and open-minded and receive that, wow, they just get breakthroughs. And those who don't, they also get breakthroughs. It just takes them a little bit more time, and there's maybe sometimes a bit of combative energy going on.
Well, and so much of it is we have, it's like any change of behavior or any decisions we make. My wife, just had two hips replaced in January. And, she was one of the rare people that does two at once. And for a year or two before, people would see her move and said, wow, you need to do this. She couldn't be told, she was a fitness instructor. She was very active. She was taking care of herself, but she finally came to a realization after a long trip we took to California and back flying of how difficult that was. She said, all right, get the information and set me up with the appointments. And once she came to that conclusion, She was able to commit. She's had a wonderful recovery, one of the greatest things she's done. But we all have to get there. Any of these life decisions, we have to get there. My 96-year-old mother we're getting ready to put her into assisted living, but we can't tell her it's time to go. We're giving her the clues and giving her the things to think about. That wouldn't it be nice to be around people and have some activities and not just be sitting alone in your little townhouse all day. So it's all about getting there here on our own. So
I've referenced at the start of our conversation that we'd talk about what your friends say when you show up to parties now without the bottle of wine, and you share with them that you are alcohol free, even though your friends are obviously still drinking and still drinkers. So what's that experience like, and how do you show up and how do you communicate to people that you're alcohol free?
well, I would go. I picked up some of the NA beers have come a long way, thank goodness, because in the early days, O'Doul's was a pretty nasty thing. But there's a lot of good options there. So if I'm going to, like, we were at a cookout with friends recently, that were several couples, and our kids had gone to school together. So we all got together, and there was a cooler full of beer, and I think somebody had something to mix some kind of a summertime drink, and I just threw non-alcoholic beers in, and I don't make a big deal of it. If people ask me, I explain. Well, I did this for myself. I felt like it was getting out of control, and people have been very accepting. The ones who aren't, I probably feel a little threatened by the fact that they know themselves, you know, well, you're not saying I've got a problem. I'm fine, and no, I'm not judging you. I just made my own choice. So it's up to them if they want to choose to put me in a negative box and they're not comfortable with it. That's okay. But I don't feel like I've really lost any friends that way. Most of them have been pretty understanding, and society as a whole, as we talk about, and you talk about on the podcast and in the program, there's a big trend recognizing in the industry and culture as a whole that, less and less is alcohol acceptable as just an everyday normal drug and thing of choice. So that
Have
makes
you
it.
had friends and acquaintances look at you through what you perceive to be a negative lens because you're not drinking? Have someone said something, or have you felt an energy exchange that might imply that they're not happy with the fact that you're not drinking?
I don't think I've had it to the not happy. I think I've had more surprise because I was always known as that guy, right? That would be the life of the party. So, what's happened, one of my nicknames in one group of people was Johnny Walker, Johnny Black. What happened to Johnny Black? Well, Johnny Black's gone. He drank as much as he could, and he's done now. So it's more people being kind of surprised by the decision because they just kind of assumed that was part of my character. But I can't, I'd have to rack my brain to say I've had somebody really go negative and say, oh, well, that's a stupid choice or anything like that.
A lot of folks who are pondering stopping drinking have shared with me that they struggle with the identity change or the perceived identity change, that if they are now a non-drinker, who are they? Like, they just don't know who that is because they've always been a drinker. And I certainly, if I go back to when I first moved to the United States in 2003 as an Australian, I remember playing rugby for Los Angeles Rugby Club, and I was known as the Aussie larrikin who drank lots of beer after the rugby game at the Sharkies pub down in Manhattan Beach, where we'd go after rugby matches. And so they loved it. They were always smiling, and they'd slap me on the back and go, "Oh, the Aussie larrikin Swanee, Swanee,
Yeah.
oh, he's a big drinker." And so that was my identity. And I really played into that in those first few years in the US, which was, I'm just going to live into this character of being the Aussie larrikin who drinks heavily with a big smile on his face. And the Americans loved it. They
Hmm.
absolutely loved it. Like, they smiled, they
Which is a
laughed,
great
they
feeling,
encouraged
right?
it. Yeah, it's a great feeling. And so I remember towards the late 2000s, I interviewed the Hollywood movie star Bradley Cooper at the SLS Hotel in Beverly Hills. He was promoting the film, ironically, called The Hangover. It was the film that actually turned him into a big breakout star. And I remember interviewing him, and he told me that he didn't drink. He hadn't drunk alcohol for some years at that point. And I remember thinking, loser, like, what an idiot, doesn't drink alcohol. God, this guy's not going to be fun to be around. That was my mentality.
Yep.
And so isn't it interesting? Like my identity was wrapped around I'm the Aussie larrikin who drinks, and then I was even judging the likes of who is now a Hollywood A-lister, an Oscar-nominated actor and director, Bradley Cooper, thinking he was a loser because he wasn't. So I'm just curious, did you have any apprehension about losing the identity of Johnny Black, I think it was, everyone knows the drinker, and now being Don Drury, the alcohol-free man?
Um, I'm sure I did, go through some of that because it was so ingrained in my behavior. And we talked about during those 90 days, especially when you're still clearing your system and going through this, traveling to events or, having some place that I would visualize in my mind. Oh, well, when it used to be I'd go to the airport, well, go to the bar before you get on the plane. Grab that drink that they offer in the cabin on the plane. When you get there, oh, I got to the hotel and we're starting work tomorrow morning. Let's go grab a bite and a couple drinks. So I would have to visualize my strategy. And a lot of us talked about that were in the program in similar veins of how we weren't going to behave that way. And then there was you're right, there's kind of an identity associated with it. But to me, I had clarity about what I'm doing with my work. We have our grandson who is great to have, as somebody to spend time with and distract you from your own little head games and all of those things. So I did find it, that I was able to make the transition into that. That doesn't have to be part of what I do and who I am. And if at the end of the day I feel like having one of those mocktails or an NA beer or something like that, I'll do that. But I even found after 9 months, I sort of did that as a replacement strategy. But anymore, it's like that isn't even part of a daily routine anymore. It's, oh, well, that would be
Mm,
good in this situation. Or if I'm out at dinner, maybe I do that. But, it's so I know some people have felt that sense of loss. I talked to some of the folks on some of the calls and they were like, yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of flat. What happens next? Right. So,
mm. But what's happened next for you is obviously working because you've committed to being alcohol free now. You're 15 months alcohol free as we're recording this. What's your plan from here?
well, I'm not ready to retire. All my friends my age are, various stages of stepping back out, but I love the
From
work
work,
I
you
do.
mean? You don't mean you're not ready to retire from alcohol. You mean you're not ready to retire from work.
Retire from work,
Yeah, just
correct.
wanted to
Yeah, no,
clarify
I'm done. I
that.
told you I'm done drinking.
Are you done drinking? Are
That's
you?
not even a question. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So that
yeah.
yeah. So just share like why do you feel so determined in that, or why do you have such conviction that you won't drink again?
Well, I think understanding, the science of addiction, which we learn about in the program, understanding the way your body's wired, and having seen friends relapse or people in the program, also having seen friends who had different addictions, or people who had children that had serious addictions and some that died and lost kids to that process. I have no desire to go back and say that one little thing that could be a trigger back into that behavior pattern and that unhealthy pattern. So to me, there's no upside to it. There's no benefit from it.
Yeah, amazing.
Yep.
Well, Don, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I bet your wife Michelle must be pretty happy as well.
Oh yeah.
And
Everybody's happy. So.
yeah, and there's a phrase, death by a thousand cuts, which is the way I use it as it relates to helping people stop drinking is, um, we're drinking for years and in many cases decades, like you were, and it's just this slow cut, 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 drip, drip, drip of energy, of focus, of blood, of life, of connection. And then suddenly you stop drinking alcohol. And I would submit it's then life by a thousand repairs, maybe.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right.
and it's like you're putting on the band-aids now and you're healing and you're nourishing and you're supporting the body and the brain and the mind and your relationships with your wife or your husband or your kids or your colleagues or your acquaintances. And so the death by a thousand cuts switches into a thousand healthy habits, or maybe it's just a few healthy habits done a thousand times. Does that resonate with you?
It definitely does. And it's also, just having the clarity and the awareness of the triggers, right? And that was one of the big learnings for me was, I think it was either Coach Sarah or one of the speakers that we had come in that talked about, the 90-second to 3-minute physical effect of some of those triggers and the hormones that they release, and being able to get through that short window of time with whatever strategies you have, and then having that feeling pass. So I mentioned going through these big changes with my mother, who's 96. Many things that go on, and I'd see these big triggers, and I do some journaling, and I'd recognize and say, in the past, I would have just wanted to grab a drink right now, but go outside, have a glass of water, take a breath, take a walk around the circle. And that feeling passes, and it's not like I've ever had the urge to go back and just sit down and start up again. So when you recognize that and you see all of the benefits that you're having from not doing it, it's definitely a continuing improvement. So,
Don Drury, 67, outside of Boston. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
all right, we'll see you in 20 or 30 years. All right, James?
Okay, Don, it's a deal.
All right, buddy. Take care.